Hello there. Welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and today we're going to start the first of several lessons on the tournament regulations and related concepts. This lesson is going to discuss tournament structure, primarily for constructed 1v1 tournaments. That'll be mostly premier tournaments, not draft, sealed, or twin suns. Some of what's covered in this lesson has been covered briefly in L1 lessons, including L1 tournament regulations and L1 running an event. But we're going to go into more detail and cover a bit more of the ideas and philosophy behind some of these regulations and structures. The hardest part of every event is getting it started. You have your players who just want to start playing but don't have anywhere to be, getting in your way, the TO who wants you to start but who also wants to keep registering more players, keeping registration open until the last second, and you also don't have any momentum to keep you going. You want to come to your event knowing a few key cutoff points. What time does registration start? When is it scheduled to end, and when will registration really end? What is the scheduled player cap, and what is your real hard cap? Is the event structure flexible based on player count? And if players need to register decks, when does registration for that close? Many large events will have online pre-registration, and most other events will allow folks to register as soon as they're present. However, sometimes registration doesn't open until an hour or two before the event begins. This is especially prevalent at larger conventions, as tournament organizers want to minimize the number of refunds they have to issue, and a player who signs up for an event but then gets distracted by a panel or otherwise doesn't return is a player who needs to be handled by the tournament organizer later. You'll also want to know the cutoff for when registration ends. At the store level, you're frequently going to have the event start time also be the cutoff for registration. The events are small enough that a player who scoots in at the last moment can quickly get registered, and the event can begin without significant delay. However, with larger events or conventions that have many side events, frequently pairings are generated before the announced start time so that players can begin closer to that announced start time rather than 5 or 10 minutes later. Preserving time for attendees is very valuable. This means that registration can frequently close 5 to 15 minutes before the event is scheduled to begin to allow for these logistical operations. Of course, there's often someone in line or a player who has a registration issue, and so that deadline is pushed back a small amount. How much events get pushed back will be dependent on the size of the event and the particular organizer, so it's something that you'll have to adapt to individually, but it's good to know. Some stores will definitely develop your reputations as places where showdowns start 15 minutes late, because there's always someone who calls ahead and says that they'll be late, and the store delays the event. However, you're also able to start the event as scheduled. Just pair the player as though they were on time and assign tardiness as appropriate. If you do this in response to a player calling in, be sure that they're aware of this happening. Some players may know that they won't be able to make it within the time limit and wouldn't want to play with a game loss or match loss. Similarly, you'll want to know both the theoretical cap on the event and the actual cap of players. Many events have a player cap, but sometimes that cap can be stretched just a little bit. It's often used as a guideline for how many players the organizer expects or how much space they usually have available. However, if 1 or 2 extra players show up and want to play, many organizers can find an extra set of chairs to add to a table and have folks just squeeze in a little bit. I've even played some pre-releases with players playing across the store counter, and I've definitely worked in convention centers to get more tables and chairs set up while players are playing in events. Nonetheless, sometimes there are events where the organizer can't break that cap and add more players. This is often because they don't have the necessary product. They have exactly enough participation promos or pre-release kits to meet their cap. It also can be because of seating limitations. As much as they might want to add more players, they might genuinely not have enough space. Knowing what the baseline player cap is gives you a good expectation for the event, but knowing the actual cap, which is again something you'll learn through experience with individual organizers, lets you be prepared for when things go unexpectedly well and your judge to player ratio will change. Next, we approach the event structure and understand whether or not it's flexible based on player count. Most casual tier events, such as weekly play, pre-releases, and even store showdowns, will be a fixed number of rounds, usually 3 or 4, and then prizes are distributed, and so they're independent of the number of players. Now, as soon as you have 4 players, you can play a full 3-round event. Each player is able to play a new player each round, and you won't have any buys. You'll have a 2-0 played against an 0-2 in the final round, but that's acceptable for a 4-player event. Competitive events, on the other hand, usually require at least 8 players to launch and have a variable number of rounds based on the attendance before top cut. The reason these events have a variable number of rounds is that you generally want to have a structure that makes it so that all players with a record of X1, which is to say 1 loss and however many wins would make up the rest of the rounds, but a number of players with X1 record or better make that top cut. This isn't an absolute requirement, but it's a common expectation for players. It's also generally desired to have an efficient tournament as possible. For example, with 64 players, you should generally run a 6-round event. You'll usually have 7 or fewer players with a record of 5 wins and 1 loss or better, which hits the goal of all X1 players making the cut. Of course, if you have more rounds, it'll still make sure that all X1 players make the cut, but it'll just be more rounds to get to that point and just burns time. We're going to talk about tournament math for a second. There's a chart in the tournament regulations, but a rough guideline for breakpoints for the number of rounds follows powers of 2. 4 rounds gives you up to 16 players, 5 rounds to 32 players, 6 rounds for up to 64 players, and 7 rounds up to 128 players. However, this math starts to break down once you get to about 200 players. Unintentional draws, pair downs, and other complications begin to screw with that math. Following tournament regulations is the best practice, but keep in mind that the closer you get to a breakpoint, the narrower your margin of error is. It is possible that you could have a 65-player event that runs 6 rounds and not 7, and not have any X1s miss the top cut. But it's not a guarantee, and players will make tournament decisions based on the reliability of this math. Thus, it's important to determine how many players you have, and announce how many runs you'll be playing at the start of the event, especially if it's not as the tournament regulations prescribe. Finally, we get to deck registration. This is one of the last things you need to know before you start your event. This is only something that should happen during competitive tier events. For casual tier events, while players should be playing the same deck for the duration of the tournament, you don't need to manage deck lists. However, for competitive, you do want and need those deck lists. Deck lists should be collected or registered before play begins for the first round. If you're using a digital deck list tool, such as the one built into Melee.gg, you can usually set a time when submissions are closed. I recommend having it closed shortly after the event is scheduled to begin. Give them a minute or so of wiggle room. This is because players who are trying to make adjustments up to the last second, especially players who registered themselves very close to the deadline, need that minute. Giving them time to input deck lists means that you have fewer paper deck lists you need to manage after the technology doesn't allow them to register anymore. If you're dealing with paper deck lists, especially en masse, you'll want to collect them before play begins for round 1. You can hold a player meeting before seedings for round 1, or you can collect them at the start of round 1. Your only other consideration is if deck lists are public. Some events will have public deck lists for the duration of the tournament. For these, deck list submission must be closed well in advance of the deck list being published. Otherwise, players can make last-minute adjustments to their deck to adapt to the now public metagame. That's pretty much everything you need to know in the lead up to the event. Now it's time to get the ball rolling. This is where we get player seeding. Often this is just for round 1, but sometimes you'll want a player meeting. A player meeting is where you have seedings for the players, but they're not seated across from an opponent. This comes with several benefits. First, it allows you to quickly check for no-shows. The first round of larger tournaments is likely to have a significant number of players who pre-registered but have not arrived. By seeding players but not pairing them, you can identify who is missing and have them drop before round 1 begins, thereby avoiding issuing round 1 buys. Second, it allows you to manage collection and distribution easily. If you have to collect deck lists, media waivers, or some other form of paperwork from players, you can seat them in alphabetical order, and then anything you collect will be in that known order rather than the randomness of first-round pairings. There are ways to index and manage that randomness, but that's not something that we're concerned with for today. It also means that players aren't seated across from their opponent, and so they're slightly less worried about revealing their deck list, although they'll still be private about it. And with digital deck lists, this is less of a concern. For goodies that you're distributing, it means that players aren't trying to play a match while you're handing them promos, tickets, playmats, vouchers, etc. If they've started a match, they're only going to be partially paying attention to judges distributing things, and it's very possible that they won't realize that they've been given something, and consequently forget about it by the time the match ends, and then come up to you and say, "Hey, I never received my promo, can I have one?" However, these advantages of player meeting are mitigated significantly at smaller events. At tournaments where you're the only judge, you can know whether or not you gave someone promos and not have to hunt down the judge who you've been told was assigned to handle that task who tells you that they delegated to someone else. I would just recommend against player meetings at smaller events because they do have a real cost in time. While it's only a couple of minutes, it's 3 or 4 minutes for players to find their seats and get settled in, and then you have another massive congestion when you assign players seatings for round 1. Many players who aren't expecting a players meeting are also confused and will treat it like the first round, fully unpacking, getting ready to play when they don't need to do that, and repacking everything will eat again into tournament progression. With that being said, many of the things you do during a player meeting can simply occur at the start of round 1, before you instruct players to begin play. Once you do, you finish the hardest part of the event, and you progress through to the end of the round, where you manage outstanding tables and time extensions and ensure that all of the results come in. There are a few priorities as rounds end. First, you want to ensure that all matches that have completed play and left their tables have been reported. These are colloquially known as ghost matches. It's critical to identify and address these, as they won't resolve on their own. The matches that are still playing are eventually going to finish their game and report their results, but ghost matches, there's nothing to tell players that, hey, you haven't reported yet other than you. Now, depending on the venue and your familiarity with the players, you can either make announcements to the hall asking generally for unreported matches to report, for specific players to report, or seek out the individuals more privately to ask them for their match result. Your next priority after handling ghosts is ensuring that tables enter the end of match procedure properly, going into their final action phase when it is appropriate to do so. Most matches can be handled with a general announcement to the tournament saying that it's time in the round, and players should finish the current round before proceeding to the final action phase. Matches with a time extension, however, may need to be addressed individually. This can be done by judges who go through aisles and check in with matches still playing. Finally, you want to ensure that judges, including yourself, are both sitting on key matches, as well as some judges being available for calls if you don't have enough judges for every table still playing. When you're watching a match during end of round, stay engaged. Your role is to not only make sure that they go into the final action phase when appropriate, but to understand the game state. That way, if an issue arises, you're able to handle it quickly and to minimize the amount of time that's spent catching up with the game. If you're distracted by a task or don't catch everything, don't worry, it happens all the time. Now, we'll be going more in depth on how to maximize your efficiency and priorities and productivity during end of round in future lessons, but for now, we're going to move on. For casual tier events, though, that's pretty much it. You'll rinse and repeat until all of the rounds are complete, and then either distribute prizes or hand over the standings to the tournament organizer, who will handle prizes. For competitive tier events, there are a few key differences. First, you might have one or more cuts. You'll sometimes have a cut to a second day of Swiss play. Playing more than 8 or 9 rounds begins to get very taxing for the players and can be equally taxing for the staff running the event. Therefore, if an event needs more than 8 rounds of play due to the number of players, play is frequently split across multiple days. These cuts are sometimes based on record, sometimes based on standing, and sometimes a hybrid approach with something along the lines of all players with record of X2 or better, or top 64, whichever is more players, make the cut. Generally, day 2 play is more Swiss, not single elimination, as players who make the cut are all live for top 8, and we don't want to eliminate an undefeated player immediately. Penalty points don't reset after cuts. There's some old tournament softwares that needed to treat second days as entirely new events, which is why some games have penalties resetting, but that's not what happens here. Now, match player history, but not match points, can reset with these cuts. This means that after a cut, you're eligible to play somebody that you've already faced in this tournament. This is necessary because if you make it to a top 8 cut, it's frequently the case that you've played against the players already in the top 8 cut. In fact, if you have an undefeated player and only one player at X1, it's almost guaranteed that the undefeated player was the individual who gave the X1 player their loss. And if they both make the top cut, which they should, and make it to the finals, which is very possible, well, it would be anticlimactic to say that they're not allowed to play each other. That's all to say that after a cut, whether it be a day 2 cut or a top 8 cut, players should be prepared to play against someone that they've already played, although the software will generally try to pair them against new players. After any additional Swiss rounds, there will be a cut to top 8 and another sized single elimination Bret. At this point, players begin to get knocked out, but we'll cover this in detail in the future lesson on running a top cut, as they have a different atmosphere than the rest of the tournament and require special attention. In any case, that's all for now. Join us next time as we talk a bit more in depth about draft and sealed in our coverage of limited events. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays on twitch.tv/swoo_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they're released, and join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community in discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.